You're listening to the Meditation and Attachment Podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
Welcome, everybody. This is Meditation and Attachment, Deepening Your Practice. It is June 3rd, 2021. It's 7:40 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And we've been talking about the path to enlightenment for the last couple of weeks, and I thought I would continue tonight talking about a knowledge of conditionality, which is the second stage. Make sure I got that right. Insight knowledge that discerns conditionality, purification by overcoming doubt. Doubt is, in this reference, the skeptical doubt that this is the path and that this path leads to enlightenment. Most of the time when you read texts like this manual of insight, the different aspects of this are infused in Buddhist thought. So, for instance, the view of conditionality is described in 5 ways in the manual. The first being that you understand that the nature of the human condition is based on these Buddhist tenets. As householders, I'm not sure of the practicality of that, particularly if you don't grow up in a Buddhist context and understanding the nature of that death is caused by life, life ends in death, and that conditions set up reincarnation as a process that's that you could choose your way out of if you were willing to pursue the path and become enlightened. Conditionality, in a more practical telling of it, would be that the current conditions set up the future conditions, and that the past conditions set up the present conditions. You could even talk about it in terms of quantum mechanics, which is one way that I like to think about it. In the present moment, what opens up in front of you are all of the possibilities that you could choose. All of the possibilities that are opening up in this moment are based on the choice that you made in the last moment, because all of the possibilities of this moment are linked to the possibilities in the past moment. As soon as you choose something in this moment, all of the choices except for the one that you took fall away, and based on that choice in the next moment opens all of the choices that are available based on the choice that you made in this moment. Is that making sense in terms of a way to go? How do we know what those conditions are that set this process in place? And so there is the Buddhist philosophy, there or the Buddhist cosmology about this. You have eye consciousness, which is capable of sensing light when it encounters a light object, a photon, and there's contact. A consciousness of that sensing experience opens. The body-mind processes it for Vedana. I like to call Vedana processing speed. If it's urgent and needs attention, it goes first. If it's neutral and doesn't matter whether you process it or not, it largely doesn't get processed. And then if it's a pleasant experience and there's time for it, then you encounter the pleasant experience. Let me just make a quick adjustment here. That basically makes sense, right? The object that can be sensed encounters the capacity to sense it. Contact happens. The consciousness of the experience of sensing arises. It's evaluated for processing speed, and then it's compared to the perceptual database. If there's a close enough match in the perceptual database, then the unfixated ultimate experience takes on the characteristics of that and is formed into uh, conceptual reality, which is a construct of the conditioning and the mind and the process of the human condition. And that can be accurate or not accurate depending on the qualities of the mind. We have then the past and the future. The conditions of the past set up the conditions of the present, which set up the conditions of the future. Um, Seeing matter in that way. One of the things that comes up in your meditation practice is that you track things. Christian?
I don't want to derail too much, but you mentioned enlightenment, and I'm curious, why would someone who doesn't believe in reincarnation want to pursue enlightenment?
What is it about enlightenment and reincarnation that makes it attractive?
It just seemed like that was the way it's posited in the sort of Buddhist idea, that it gets you out of reincarnation. Or maybe I'm missing something. But why would I want to pursue enlightenment, I guess, is the question I'm asking.
So it's an interesting point. If you become enlightened, then you don't have to be reincarnated. So you don't have to suffer anymore. If you practice meditation and you develop these skills for being in the world in such a way that you don't suffer anymore, is that enough?
Yeah, I think so.
So then whether you're reincarnated or not doesn't matter as much as really the desire is to end the experience of suffering.
So then the doubt, the extinguishing of doubt would be the idea that I can end my suffering.
Right.
I practice.
This practice, this path would lead to the end of your suffering. And would that be sufficient?
That'd be great.
For it to be worth doing?
Sign me up.
How I think about it. I tend to be. I don't mean this as a belief. I don't. It isn't so much an experience of believing or choosing to believe something or choosing not to believe something, but what is the experience of that? It's an interesting conversation to have. Really, we live in the West, and most of the time meditation is taught in the Western Buddhist context or in a secular context, which removes the practices from spirituality and a spiritual context for the practice. Uh, in the very in the most secular practices, it's taught as a stress reducer and a happiness booster. And in a large swath of the Western Buddhist world, enlightenment is not thought of something that is attainable. And so it isn't the general topic of practice. I have a certain frustration with this because when I practice in a Buddhist context with the spiritual instruction included, I notice that most of the states that arise in those practices I've had lots of experience of in the secular practices or in the Western mindfulness practices, but they've never been contextualized in a spiritual way that they then are useful in furthering enlightenment. It becomes more about states that you can get into, and there's even a competition around which states that you can get into. There's a lot of talk about the states themselves and the qualities of the states, but without them being contextualized in a spiritual framework of the value of them in terms of what leads to the experience of enlightenment, or even what enlightenment is, doesn't really arise in the context of that way of teaching, which I find particularly frustrating. I've sat a retreat with Dan for 8 days and noticed that in the practices that he was teaching, as each thing was contextualized spiritually, it changed the flavor of the experience in a way that was very useful, even though the states were something I was quite used to from other practices that I'd done. Jake?
I was just wondering if you could speak to the relationship between the attachment work and spirituality as you're defining it within the religious sense, and how I just wanted to toss that into the mix in the conversation what you were speaking to, and see
Because
if you
it's
could speak.
meditation and attachment, is that why you're doing this?
Right. No, because just the idea that you're bringing up, that in the West you're saying that typically we're practicing in a secular world and not a religious world or a spiritual worldview. And I was wondering if you could connect that to the attachment work. Like, can there be spirituality without like, secure attachment? I mean, what's the relationship between attachment repair and spiritual aspiration compared to having an insecure kind of framework or way that you're looking at the world and the sort of secular practice? I was wondering if you could speak to that.
In householder practice, I'm not a monastic and don't live in a monastic environment to comment particularly on that. But in a householder environment, we exist in a collaborative framework. I don't grow any of my own food. I don't I procure any of the fuel that I use. I didn't build the car that I drive. Without all of those contributions of all of those people, the way that my life functions would not be possible if I had to do all of that myself. There's an exchange often of money, but I provide services and I get money and then I exchange that with other people. That's the context in which I live. And so the capacity to relate to people in a collaborative way is very useful for that system to work. And you can see that people who are very good at that, very collaborative, very able to engage and connect other people, tend to have a stable platform in which to explore the things that are then meaningful to them. Particularly in the West, in the way that we practice, practice itself is very resource intensive, and if you aren't able to generate some sense or some capacity for resources, you are unable to practice. One of the things that makes the Buddha Dharma in the West so white and so affluent is that there is no societal support for the practice, and if you don't have the capacity to draw that toward yourself, then you don't have the capacity to practice. I think that in the U.S. the group that has the largest POC involvement in it is Nairishan Buddhism, which is also called prosperity Buddhism. So it's organized around generating that kind of sense of prosperity, which is very different than the spiritual description of Dharma in the more affluent communities.
Yeah. That's kind of why I wanted to ask, because when you go to a Dharma center, the ones I've been to, they just have this feeling of kind of uppityness and kind of whiteness, and and there comes with that sense of sort of competition, this sort of sense of like you maintain your personality structure and that has its sort of defensive positioning and its aspirational kind of competitiveness, and just take that into the world of meditation. And I was wondering if you thought that, doing the attachment work as a preliminary practice could really help soften that, or if there is a way to sort of point that out to people, or is it just the sort of thing like the way Dan set it up, like if people see that in themselves and want to change that, then they come, but otherwise don't make that something that stands out too much.
Mostly I notice that before I was teaching so much about attachment, that people came to Buddha Dharma because of suffering, their own suffering. And also they came because the other approaches that they had tried, and usually they had tried many, did not offer relief to the suffering. And so, way back when, this was more sort of a sidetrack from mainstream culture. That after trying the approaches in mainstream culture to address the suffering experience that you had, and they didn't work, you ended up in meditation practices.
Right.
It has since become quite a bit more mainstream than that. And in the early part of my teaching experiences, there tended to be two distinct groups of people. If you looked at a bell curve of the distribution of people doing well in the world or not doing well in the world, the people that did very poorly were in the meditation rooms, and the people that did really well were in the meditation rooms, and nobody else was there. The reason that the people who did really well were there was because they could easily get any goal they set for themselves, and they remained unhappy in their experience of being alive, and they were looking for a source of meaningfulness that would solve that for them. The people that functioned really poorly didn't have the experience of getting their goals easily met, and so they were really looking for a way to repair themselves so that they could get into the fray of competition. And I noticed in when I started teaching that both groups would come to the classes, and that there would be an antagonism between them. The super successful people, or the people who, maybe that's not a good word, people who could easily reach the goals that they set for themselves, would plow ahead and do tons of practice and get really excellent at doing the practice. And the people that could barely function could barely practice, barely understand anything. And the upper end of it wanted to zoom as fast as they could go, and the other end could barely keep up. And so there would be an antagonism between the teaching not going fast enough and the teaching going too fast. And so they actually began to separate in that way. So then what you see is a culture where the people that like to go really fast have these centers where they can go really fast, but they don't really serve the people that can barely function very well. And then you come into the places where people don't function very well, and there's very few resources available to that group for them to practice.
Do you think that sort of, I'm sorry to keep going on and on, this is the last time I'll raise my hand or speak
you
out
don't
in a
have
session.
to restrict yourself in that way.
Is it? I just don't want to take everyone's time or whatnot if others have questions, but I was just wondering what do you think about that aspiration of, like you said, I mean, to be in the world and to be competitive and acquisitive and, getting things that you want. Do you think that sort of skill set, how does that serve people in a spiritual or religious sense? I mean, I know if you're approaching meditation through the secular worldview, you can do that sort of plowing ahead, getting what you want, knowing yourself, like that same sort of mental framework, and just applying that into the meditation world because the context is secular. but do you think that's something? I mean, do you think that's what it if the context is different, if the context is inherently spiritual or religious, then what is that sort of drive to be getting ahead and plowing ahead and getting your way? Does that then become something that looks more like maladaptive and not really totally coherent with the goals of spirituality or religion? I think that was the thing I'm trying to bring up.
So I don't worry about that so much in people
Yeah.
that work really hard and achieve, because if you can guide them into what to practice, what
Mhm.
insights arise from what they're practicing, and if you
Okay.
guide them well, they will break open their own heart into bodhicitta, that awakened
Mm.
heart, and that will change all of that motivation in a way that's much more wholesome in terms of what we understand,
Okay.
and that it's a natural outcome of the practice if they practice in a way that's well guided. So you don't actually
Mm.
have to worry about that at all. You just have to encourage them to practice in a way that will open their heart, and then once their heart is open, they will see the world the way that it is and be inclined toward uh, um, uh, helping, I guess is the way I would
Right.
describe it. They'll be inclined toward being service of the world because that's where they're finding the meaning, which is what they came to find in the first
I
place.
see. I see. So
It's
that's how it's transformed. It isn't that people with a really strong drive decrease that drive. It's that their drive gets transformed into something positive.
right. It's
I see.
more
Okay.
of a danger in the group that doesn't function very well, because if you can get them to function better, they want to start competing in the
Mm.
secular world and achieve secular goals, because they haven't been able to get through the cycle of discovering that the attaining of those goals often doesn't provide the meaning that they were looking for.
I see. I see.
It's very easy to say that all of these objects don't have any meaning because you've acquired all of those objects and you haven't found the meaning in them. It's harder for people that haven't been able to acquire any of them to understand that actually there's nothing in them that will provide the meaning that you're actually describing.
Okay.
And
So even in a religious context or a spiritual context, you want to help people be able to achieve their secular goals as a prerequisite towards their spiritual development.
well, I think that one of the reasons the attachment stuff is so useful for the group that doesn't function well is that most of the time the root cause of that is the attachment disturbances. And that if you can teach them to repair the attachment disturbance and include in that an understanding of what exploration is and what meaning is and how to explore so that you're actually pursuing a primary exploration and not a secondary one, then they find what is actually meaningful and can then, in that sense, bypass. Oops, bypass is such a tricky word in our culture, but they can forego or renounce the need for that kind of material success because they're already finding meaningfulness
I
just
see.
in the way that
Wow.
it's set up, um, in terms of the practice.
Okay, thank you a lot for describing that. That helps me have a more better understanding of the model that you've developed.
The if you grow up with a sense of security, which is a really low bar. I mean, I know that because I teach meditation and attachment, that most of the audience that comes to this come because I'm talking about attachment difficulties, which sets up this whole cascade of other difficulties. But when you don't have all of that and you have a sense of security in the world, you already have a habit, and you have a lifelong habit of placing around yourself the essential people that you need to support you, And they do support you in the things that you find interesting for yourself. And so you have all of those, all of the bases that you need to dive in and go deep. But if you don't have that and you aren't able to set up supportive relationships around you, and you're dealing with the very difficult early experiences that lead to attachment disturbances, it's very easy to bump into things on the spiritual path that completely derail you. And then you don't have the support team around you to help you integrate those experiences. And so you can't go forward, or you go forward in fits and starts. And the terrible suffering that you experience isn't relieved enough to make it possible really to continue. So you need to really meet people where they are and attend to them in a way that they need to be attended to, so that they have the direct experience that that's a possibility. So I was teaching a class earlier, and I described this very basic setup for uh, entering into secure functioning relationships. The first is that you pay attention as you're engaging somebody, whether you feel emotionally regulated by them or not. Do you feel better after a half an hour of being with them? Do you feel the same, or do you feel worse? That's essential to know. These processes of emotional co-regulation are unconscious, they're automatic. Your conditioning meets somebody else's conditioning, and they either mesh well or they don't. And if they don't mesh well, there's not a whole lot that you can do about that to get it to work better. You really do have to pay attention to who has the capacity to regulate you and who doesn't. If they regulate you, then you need to pay attention to whether you're regulating for them. You could be dysregulating for them. They could be really regulating for you, and you could be dysregulating for them. Or they could be really regulating for you, and they don't have much effect one way or the other on being with you. Or you could be really regulated by them, and they could be really regulated by you, and that's very valuable, and you want to recognize that. But you have to ask them. You have to have the experience several times with them at the beginning to see whether that reliably happens. If both of those things happen, then you have to inquire of them what it is that you would have to do for them so that they felt well taken care of. And then you would have to evaluate whether you will enjoy doing that, because you're going to have to do a lot of it, and you're going to have to do it over the course of the whole relationship. And if you don't like it, or you don't enjoy doing it, you won't do enough of it that they'll feel taken care of, and the relationship won't settle into a productive experience. And then the last piece is, will they enjoy taking care of you in the way that you need to be taken care of? Because if they don't enjoy it, they won't do enough of it so that you feel taken care of. And so if all four of those things are in place, then you really have the possibility of developing a relationship that has legs. But secure people have always done this. They always consider this unconsciously or consciously, and they value and are willing to put the time, energy, and resources into relationships that support them, because they know the value of being supported. They know the value of being encouraged. But people with insecure attachment don't know that. So one of the things that you need to do is change your mind about it, and take the risk of putting a lot of energy into a relationship that has these qualities in it, and not, um, in some sense, dump a lot of energy into a relationship that actually can't go anywhere. If these four things are not in place at the beginning, they're not going to be in place 2 years down the line.
Right.
And so you'll have squandered, I say squandered because I want to be slightly hyperbolic about this. You'll have squandered 2 years of energy on a relationship that didn't provide for you. And that will further reinforce the idea that relationships are unreliable, and you can't risk putting the energy into them. Whereas if you picked and carefully developed the relationship so that it was worth the time, energy, and resources, then you have this support that you don't have to work at. Secure relationships settle. They don't constantly abrupt. They don't take a lot of management back and forth. You make agreements, the relationship settles in, and you fulfill your responsibilities. The other person fulfills their responsibility, and all of that extra energy that comes from that, you can then use for your exploration. People who are afraid to explore, of course, would prefer to use up all of that energy, so there's no energy to explore, so they don't have a sense of failure in not being able to explore. So they get into relationships that are extremely volatile. All of the energy is consumed by trying to get the relationship to function a little bit. There's nothing left over for exploration. And so they don't have to explore. They don't have to get into those uncomfortable places that children get into, but if they have the support of their caregivers, can work through and develop the skill set. If you didn't have that, of course, you have to do it now as an adult, which is a little bit more challenging, or a lot more, depending on how the conditioning went, how you were treated. 30% of the time or better, your needs need to be met by your caregivers in order to be secure. I want to really emphasize how astonishingly low the bar is. If you have attachment disturbances, please also understand how difficult those childhood experiences were when even 30% of the time your needs weren't being met. I think it's one of the things I think about it as an arrogance of secure people is they have no concept of how difficult the childhood experiences were of people who have attachment disturbances. They can't conceive of it because their childhoods were nothing like that. Less than 30% of the time your most basic needs are met. And you develop these strategies to cope with the severity of that, with the difficulty of that. And you're a child with very limited capacities in comparison to what adult capacities are. So we come in, if you have attachment disturbances and you're looking for a way out of suffering, and you're presented with a description of enlightenment, which is going to relieve that suffering, and you're presented with instructions that are fairly general, and then you attempt to develop a meditation skill around that, and oftentimes, particularly if it's not managed well, and you're pushed into some kind of insight practice right off the bat, it really heightens the experience of distress that you have, because it's pointing to this conditioning that was so challenging, and so particularly in the low functioning group, but you have our sprints at trying to learn to practice, and then it becoming too difficult and stopping, wandering away. And then when the suffering of life gets again too great and you look for some solution, then maybe you come back in and do another sprint at trying to get somewhere so that your suffering is relieved. I need a lot of instructions, and I need little tiny steps because of the way that my thinking process goes. I'm dyslexic, I'm dyspraxic, I'm dyscalculic, I'm pretty much the whole dysgraphic. I mean, I read at probably a third of the rate that somebody who doesn't have all of that. Everything for me is really slow, and it takes a lot of deliberation and determination to get through it because it's so difficult. But it's always been like that for me. And so if I wanted to learn anything, I knew that I needed to go through that process. You'd think audiobooks would be better, but the hearing part is worse than the reading part in terms of word order. My people used to say they thought I was profound because we'd go out in a group, but my mind doesn't separate words based on who's saying them. It just plays them in the order that I hear them. So if I'm at a group, sitting at a table, and 2 or 3 people are talking at the same time, I'm not separating them by who's saying what. I'm just hearing the string of words in the order that they're coming into my ear. So I have to try and piece together the information that's coming in so that I can understand what the conversation is. And it's very easy to get that wrong. So I'm constantly misunderstanding what's happening. And so what typically happens to me in a group is I just fall silent because I can't keep up with the language. So we all have whatever it is that we have that we need to do to learn. So the one of the reasons that Shinzen was very helpful to me is that he's very step oriented, and the steps are small, and I could follow them easily. So I could actually have a meditative experience from that. One of the reasons that Dan is my teacher is because he's in the pointing out the great way style, which is very intense, very deliberate instructions that move in small steps. So that's the way that I learn. A very general approach doesn't work at all for me. I can't understand it really. And I've never really been in a situation where I've gotten too much instruction in that way. And I have had people say to me, "You over instruct everything," but that's the thing that lets me learn, and so that's how I tend to frame things. That's all making sense, right? So we come in really with the thing that we want to get out of the practice. Most of us come in with no idea what the practice is, no idea what the practice is going to deliver. We're not oriented to that. We don't even want to know that. What we want to know is, can you help me with this thing that's happening to me that I can't find any other help for? That's mainly who comes into meditation practice. So then, how do you address that? In the teacher role, of course, you need to respond individually to each person, but then create these structures so that people can come in to learn. The reason why I think enlightenment is something that's worth going for is because the suffering is so minimal in that. And if you come in because you're suffering and you can understand these basic things, then you can come into a place where there's very little suffering. Occasionally you get caught up and there's suffering there, but most of the time you're not suffering that much. I think one of the things that was so mind-blowing to me was that when I flipped out of being totally oriented towards self and moved into orientation of awareness, the suffering fell away. And it was mind-blowing to me how intense the suffering had been and how long that I had endured it. It was really surprising to me that I could have endured that for so long. And now I don't endure it much at all. I do sometimes get caught up. And then I have a lot of strategies in order to come out of them. Is that all making sense? We have not gone so deeply into the second stage, but I do want to come back just for a second and talk about inferential knowledge. We don't need to pick up everything. We need to pick up some things and to have a really clear experience of some things. And then anything that's in that pattern we can infer will operate in the same way. Is that making sense? So that if you take in I consciousness and then I mind consciousness forms it into something, you can infer from that that each time there's I consciousness, which arises because the capacity to sense meets an object that can be sensed, I consciousness arises. That I mind consciousness then will take that light and form and shape it into something if the pattern is recognized. And that will happen with all I consciousness meeting I mind consciousness. Is that making sense? And it also applies to all of the other sense gates. If you hear a sound, that is to say, the sound object has contact with the capacity of ear consciousness, then ear consciousness arises, and then mind will then attempt to understand what that sound is. And if it does succeeds in that, then ear mind consciousness arises. And that each time the object that can be sensed encounters the capacity to sense, the consciousness of that sensing experience will arise, and mind will then attempt to decide what it is. And each time it decides what it is, I mind consciousness will create conceptual reality. Is that making sense? Based on the conditions, the past, present, and future, the past conditioning informs what the present experience is, which sets up the meaning for the future experience. Is that all pretty clear? So one way to explore this in meditation is to begin to pay attention to the activity of mind. So there's a few ways to do that. One is that if you don't intentionally direct your awareness toward something, what you'll notice is it's directed. It goes to things. That there's a preference for the things that it goes to. Some things you like, so you pay more attention to them. Some things you dislike, so you avoid paying attention to them. That's the activity of mind. Mind also gathers snapshots or mind moments and strings them together, and you create this experience of the present moment based on that. So one way to describe that would be you're reading something in a book, and then you hear a bird, and so your attention is drawn from the book to the sound of the bird. But the sound of the bird then creates a picture and visual thinking of the bird, and your attention moves from the sound of the chirping of the bird to the image of the bird in the mind. But the image of the bird in the mind is from the past, and so as you pick up the rest of the experience beyond the bird, you're then drawn into a memory of something that happened in the past, and then there's a flood of images of memories around the time that you originally heard the bird cry. And then you're then out of the experience of the present moment into the succession of memories of what happened in the past, and then the bird chirps again, and you come back in to the experience of the present moment where you are, and then you realize that you were reading a book, and then you return to the experience of reading the book. And that was all the movement of the condition before setting up the condition of the present moment, which then sets up the condition of the next moment. Is that making sense in terms of a description? Because what I want you to do now is, in practice, is pay particular attention to the movement of your attention throughout the period of meditation. Jake?
I was going to say, yeah, it does make sense, except for the way that you use the word you, because it's an automatic process of mind. It's not that you are doing that. It's just happening. You is a different subject, isn't it?
English is missing vital words.
I think it's important to point that out, though, because it's not like you are making
No.
that process happening.
Totally right. The mind is doing it. The process is happening. What word would you use?
No, I wouldn't say there is a word, because there's a process. It's a process, right? If
Right.
you say the mind, also, that's like a noun. It doesn't
Right.
work. It's the process is happening. So it has to be like in that framework. The description is in that framework where there's. I just wanted to point that out or share
I'm
that.
very happy that you did, because you're completely right.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes.
Go ahead and take your meditation posture. We are a little bit late for starting the meditation, so we'll do 30 minutes. So any comments or questions about the practice? Christian?
I noticed something really interesting when it was just see, hear, feel. It was kind of like really subtly going between see and feel. And I was mostly just following my breath for the feel. And then the see was kind of seeing into the darkness and being aware of that. And then when you opened it up into focus in, focus out, like immediately feel in popped up and like dominated the whole thing, which I found really interesting because I wasn't feeling that sensation before that. So it's like I got permission to feel it or something like that.
Good clarity. Someone else? All good? So thank you for coming. I really appreciate your practice. We have a retreat coming up on June 12th. There's still a few spots in it if you want to practice. We do a metta vipassana retreat. So the first half of the retreat is all metta practice, and the second half of the retreat is all vipassana practice. We have 2 tracks. You can do the attachment track, or you can do the liberation track, either one. So take a look at that. And then in July, I'm starting a series of day-longs on the meditation and attachment level 1. We'll go through the whole framework of using meditation to repair attachment. And then the fourth in the series is called Meditation and Attachment for Relationships, which is about how the dynamics of secure functioning relationships. So take a look at that. And then we're actually considering, depending on how the summer goes and what happens with the pandemic, doing an in-person retreat in December up in the Sierras. So take a look at that. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that you'll support me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing by making a donation. There's a link to do it on the website, but also in the email you would have gotten about the class. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your practice, and we'll see you soon, I hope. Bye now.